welcome.
And you?
That first row there, there's two right in the middle.
Very easy to say.
Sorry, we thought that was
How many? Two. I can put a chair over there.
Going out with
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Monik Suri, and I'm the student director of the IOP Book Club. This evening, I'm proud to welcome you to the final book club-sponsored event of the year. The book club's mission is to serve as a forum in which students and authors can come together to discuss relevant, politically oriented works recently in print. This fits into the overarching mission of the Harvard Political Union, the student group that runs the book club and other events and other programs such as Arena Politica, the 101 series, Pizza and Politics, and Lunch in Mem Hall. This past year, the book club has had tremendous success in generating enthusiasm for politics and the political process. This year's guests have included Professors Randall Kennedy and Dana Villa, journalist David Brock, and Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Edmund Morris. As this is our final event of the year, I would like to take this moment to thank Senator David Pryor, the man behind the book club, and the reason why I'm here today. The IOP Book Club was one of many visions that Senator Pryor brought with him to the Institute of Politics when he became its director 2 years ago. As many of you know, Senator Pryor is leaving this year, and he's leaving Harvard. Though his presence will be sorely missed, his legacy, of which this book club is just one small part, will remain behind to inspire and influence students in future years. On behalf of the IOP Book Club and undergraduates at the IOP, I would like to introduce Senator David Pryor, who will welcome our guest for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you very much, man. Thank you, man. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening on this cold and rainy May night. I think it's February, actually, and someone forgot to tell us about it. But we want to thank all of you for coming out and braving the weather tonight to be here, not only for our last book club, but also the last forum of this year. We've had some, I think, around 150 forums in the past 2 years since I've been here. And I can tell you that they have been splendid in every way. We have had speakers from all political stripes, all political persuasions, and it has truly been remarkable to see this number of forums with this quality of talent that we have had appearing right here on this stage. And we want to thank all of you for your great support. I want to also say a word of thanks to Manik, thanking him so much for his leadership and making the book club work. I hope next year that this is going to even gain more momentum and more of you will participate in it. Those events where we have had books reviewed have been remarkable. They've been intimate gatherings, and we urge you to attend those. We usually have the book club gatherings in one of the dorms or one of the houses, and of course you can keep posted as to where they will be next year. The book club also has had great support from our staff here at the Institute of Politics, especially from Christian Flynn. Christian, you're right over here, and thank you, Christian, very much. And from his worthy partner, Nora Kelly, who's going to be going and leaving the Institute in just about 2 weeks, and this Institute is going to miss Nora very, very much. And so we are here at another milestone. Well, tonight, our final forum is going to be, once again, a soaring experience, because tonight's guest is the one and only, the renowned author, David Halberstam. He is the author of a dozen books. His most recent work, Firehouse, is an intimate portrait of the courageous firefighters from Engine 40, Ladder 35, who in the course of their job fell victim during the most horrific terrorist attack on American soil. Let me, if I could, just read you a word from Vanity Fair that is a letter to the editor, May 2002 edition, where I think some of this book originally appeared, David, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, several letters to the editor, I should say, about this particular story that he's telling. And I will quote, "Halberstam has done it again. He's simply the best at doing what he does. Is he a national treasure or what?" Well, tonight we're honored not only to have him, but also we're very honored to have some special guests. Our honored guests tonight, we have invited Chief Reardon and the representatives of the Cambridge, Massachusetts Fire Department. We would love to have you stand if you're members of the Cambridge Fire Department. Right over here, right here. Thank you very much. Wow. Thank you so very much. Thank you. We're honored and flattered that you would come. We have another special guest who is a mid-career, closely akin to firemen. It would be, of course, our police department, especially New York City Police Department, Lieutenant Bobby Harnishberger. Bobby, would you please stand up? Lieutenant Bobby Harnishberger, who is one of us, or I should say one of you, as a mid-career student in the Kennedy School of Government. And he here tonight is not here as a Kennedy School student. He is here because he wanted to honor the New York City firemen, and also because his brother is a member of the New York City Fire Department, your colleagues. Tonight, to talk about our special interview and to do this special visit tonight on stage will be Callie Crosley. Callie has been the producer, director, and writer for Eyes on the Prize, an effort that won her an Emmy Award. She has been producer for ABC's 2020. She regularly appears on WGBH, a local PBS affiliate, and that program is Beat the Press, Media Criticism Show. It's kind of interesting to see members of the media criticize themselves. I watched Callie the other night on there. Notably, Callie served as an IOP Fellow. She was an Institute of Politics Fellow with us this past semester. She has made great contributions and truly has been a remarkable presence in our lives here at the Institute of Politics. She's led we want to give her a hand, we will in just a moment. She's led a study group on the media, its perspectives, and its biases. Ladies and gentlemen, to interview our very distinguished guest, David Halberstam, tonight, Callie Crosley. Callie, it's all yours.
I first wanted to give you a little bit more about our honored guest, and it's my privilege to be here. Many of you may know that he graduated from Harvard, and in fact, he began his journalistic career while a student writing for the Harvard Crimson. What you may not know is that when he graduated, he went to work in my neck of the woods, the Deep South, at a tiny newspaper in Mississippi, in fact, the smallest daily in the state, the Daily Times Leader in West Point, Mississippi.
And got fired from it after 10 months, too.
But you said of that time, it was a wonderful way to begin a career. The town was so small that I could watch the structure of power and how it worked. I brought that to Nashville and then to Vietnam. He was fired a year afterwards for writing freelance articles about the civil rights movement for a journal called The Reporter. He next got a job at the Nashville Tennessean, where he was writing about the young civil rights workers like Diane Nash and the Gandhi influence leader, the Reverend James Lawson. Many years later, he followed up those stories in a book called The Children. I urge you to read it if you have not. It was from Nashville that he went to the New York Times and distinguished himself with his foreign reporting. Since this is Harvard, one of the other awards bestowed upon Mr. Halberstam is one that Nieman Fellows like myself are very proud of. He was awarded the first Louis Lyons Award presented by the Nieman Fellowship Program. His books, which, by the way, much to my surprise, include a novel entitled One Very Hot Day. I've never seen this book, reflect his varied interests. He's written about sports in books like The Summer of '49 and The Amateurs, A Portrait of a Rowing Team, and Playing for Keeps, Michael Jordan and the World He Made. He's explored the power of the media in The Powers That Be, American cultural and social change in the 50s, business in The Reckoning, and of course politics in The Best and the Brightest, and most recently, War in a Time of Peace, Bush, Clinton, and the Generals. Just a few little snippets of what people say about his writing style. Experienced, eloquent, and always observant. David Halberstam is a journalistic jack of all trades. Mr. Halberstam retains to a remarkable degree the gut journalistic instinct of being interested in anything and everything, and a generosity that compels him to share the wealth. His portraits are superb, perceptive, literary, multidimensional, in context. We see the seemingly unending procession of characters in actions, transactions from a distance, up close, and occasionally even from inside their heads. And that's the perspective at which he brings to his newest book called Firehouse, which examines the intimate relationship of the men in Ladder 35, Engine 40, 13 of whom responded to the World Trade Center attack on September 11th. Only one of the 13, Kevin Shea, survived. I've asked Mr. Halberstam if he would begin by reading an excerpt or two from the book.
Well, let me warn you that I'm not a reader. When they turn your books into books on tape and they ask me if I want to read, I pretend to be very generous and say, no, there's somebody out there for whom it's a job, and the truth is I don't think that I read terribly well, and I haven't prepared for this, but I'll give it a shot here. A firehouse, most firemen believe, is like a vast, extended second family, rich, warm, joyous, and supportive, but on occasion quite edgy as well, with all the inevitable tensions brought on by so many forceful men living so closely together over so long a period of time. What gradually emerges is a surprisingly nuanced, extended family, where the cumulative human texture has slowly evolved over time and is often surprisingly delicate. It is created out of hundreds of unseen, unknown, and often unidentified tiny adjustments that these strong, willful men make to accommodate one another, sometimes agreeably and sometimes grudgingly. It incorporates how the men live with each other day in and day out, and surprisingly the degree to which, whether they realize it or not, they come to love each other, sometimes even as they dislike each other, because love is a critical ingredient in the fireman's code, which demands that you are willing to risk your life for your firehouse brothers. The men not only live and eat with each other, they play sports together, go off to drink together, help repair one another's houses, and most important, share terrifying risks. Their loyalties to one another by the demands of the dangers they face must be instinctive and absolute. Thus are firehouse codes fashioned. When a probationary or apprentice firefighter joins a house, he must adjust to the firehouse culture rather than the firehouse adjusting to him. It is like the military in that respect. Idiosyncrasy can come later. Adherence to the rules and traditions comes first. Now this is about two of the men who were extraordinary men who died that day from this house. They are chauffeurs, Jimmy Giberston and Bruce Gary. The chauffeurs on duty that morning, Jimmy Giberston on the truck and Bruce Gary on the engine, were men at the very core of the Firehouse. Being a chauffeur meant that you had one of the most demanding and important jobs of all, finding the best route to a fire, positioning the rig so that the men could best work the fire, and for the chauffeur of the engine, managing to find water. Giberston and Gary were both considered absolutely first-rate, and more than any of the officers came and went and were never a major part of the daily life of the house. The two of them, each in his own way, were largely responsible for maintaining the firehouse's traditions and codes. As the saying goes, the men run the firehouse, but they are kind enough to let their officers work there. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. No one wanted to cross them, in part because they were both physically strong, forceful men, but also because of their personal integrity. Both Giberston and Gary had the sheer physical power to dominate others if they so chose. And Gary could do it with his tongue as well. If someone was screwing up, if someone had to be told to help clean up the kitchen or to wash the rig, then Gary would get on him verbally. Giberston, on the other hand, was a quiet man. Jimmy Giberston was about 6'3" and 220 pounds, and he was quite possibly the strongest man in the house. He had huge hands and feet. When the men got their boots, a pair would come in one box, but Giberston's feet were so big that each boot came in a separate box. 6 days before the terrorist attack, he marked his 20th anniversary with the fire department. 43 years old, he was thinking of retiring sometime in the next year. As a result, he had started going for the overtime to get his final full-year salary, on which his pension would be based, as high as possible. On the morning of September 11th, Giberston was doing a mutual, covering for a colleague who was studying for the lieutenant's exam, and as usual, he'd come in a little earlier that day. He was judged to be an uncommonly talented man in terms of his professional skills, even by the exacting standards firemen use to measure each other. His captain, Jim Gormley, thought him to be the most gifted natural firefighter he'd ever seen. Quote, Jimmy was always in the right spot, or the wrong spot because it would be the most dangerous one, always instinctively moving to where he should be before you even asked him to, Gormley recalled of him later. But Giberston never tried for an officer's slot and refused to study for the lieutenant's exam. Gormley had often pushed him to take it, but Giberston had always resisted. He was comfortable as one of the men, absolutely sure he was doing what he wanted, eager for no additional burdens or responsibilities. Giberston needed, Gormley thought, nothing that he did not already have. Giberston worked all the time, even when it was not at the firehouse. If one of the other firemen needed help with house repairs or renovations, Giberston would inevitably show up to help out. He was, among other things, the resident wallpaper specialist. When he hung paper at the home of a colleague, he barely spoke to anyone while on the job and refused any food or drink. Carrying his special wallpaper razor in his teeth, he would do the job perfectly, then refusing any money, he would disappear as politely and silently as he had arrived. The sense of inner obligation to other firemen was particularly strong with him. Once when it was cold out and Mike Cthulhu was about to go on vacation, Cthulhu discovered there was too little gas in his car and engine, and the engine somewhat predictably would not start. Cthulhu thought to pour a little gas in the carburetor to prime it, but by mistake he used oil instead of gas, thereby completely messing up the engine. Giberston not only lent Cthulhu his car, but while his friend was on vacation, he took Cthulhu's engine out, broke it down completely, cleaned it, and reassembled it so it worked perfectly by the time Cthulhu returned. We're going to jump now to Bruce Gary. The others were in awe of Gary's sheer physical strength. He was not that tall, perhaps 5'9" or 5'10", but he weighed 230 pounds, most of it solid muscle. He had forearms like Popeye's, one of the other firemen noted. He liked to roll up his sleeves and show off his arms, according to his friend Bob Mennick. They looked like nothing so much as 4x4s. Gary had pushed the others to create a weight room in the house, a decision that at the time had astonished some of the old-timers who never worked out like he did and who were a little reluctant to contribute their share of the money for the equipment. Gary worked out all the time. He could bench press about 300 pounds. He was also a considerable athlete, a good softball player, a good hockey player, and a good skier, and he was very proud of his athletic ability. Once at the Firehouse, they had a younger man named Joe Laterza who was also a very good athlete. He apparently had been a great schoolboy sprinter, but Bruce Gary was not impressed. He claimed that he could beat Laterza in a race. No one believed he could. Joe was younger and looked more like a sprinter, but once the challenge was out there, Bruce being Bruce, a showdown was inevitable. So they roped off 2 blocks on Amsterdam Avenue and held the race. To everyone's surprise, save that of Bruce Gary, Gary won. I'm going to jump ahead here to the moment of some of the men coming back to work on the ruins, the colleagues who didn't go out that day but were reassembling. To the degree they could, the rescue workers from 4035 worked the edges of the ruins, shouting the names of their colleagues and stopping everyone they met to ask if they had heard or seen anything of the men from Engine 40 or 35 truck. Sean Newman, one of the first of the 4035 off-duty men to get there at around 10:30, knew immediately that the news was going to be very bad. Everywhere he went, he asked the other firemen if they had seen or heard anything about the men from his house. But no one knew anything. In time he found the rigs, but by then he was already so aware of the completeness of the tragedy that he could not bring himself to look alongside the officer's seat where a list of the men who had gone on the run was kept. He did not want to see the names of his friends and colleagues who had been caught up in this terrible day and whom he feared might all be dead. He did, however, see a giant shoe where the chauffeur of the truck had sat, and he knew that it meant that Jimmy Guyberson had been driving, because in the house only Guyberson had feet that big. He knew as well that it meant that they had surely lost Jimmy. Terry Holden had never seen wreckage like this before. Usually if there was a collapse, it was possible to dig through it to some of the pockets, known as voids, in which the firemen might have survived. But this chaos was so enormous. It was an avalanche of steel and concrete that had fallen straight down. The weight of the collapsed material was beyond Holden's comprehension. It was hard to look at this and think of anyone living through it. Firemen like to think that their will and their talents are great enough to fight back against the awesome force of even the worst fire. But no one could imagine challenging this collapse and rolling it back. There was not going to be much in the way of voids, Terry Holden thought. And then Callie marked all these places. These are, by the way, not my selection, so I hope you're okay. This is a little bit from the author's notes. And it tells about Graydon Carter, the editor of Vanity Fair, being generous enough to ask me to go and do this. When he asked me to go over there to the Firehouse and learn and write about the men, I was eager to take on the assignment. His instinct for a story and the latitude he gave a writer to pursue it and the trust he gave me was quite extraordinary. I first visited the Firehouse in mid-October and spent most of the next 2.5 months there. One of the things that makes a career in journalism both pleasurable and valuable over time, for me a very long time, is the reward that comes in discovering again and again the nobility of ordinary people. Rarely have I had so strong a sense of that as when I was with the firemen. There are very few stories that I've written in my almost 50 years as a journalist that have been so personally rewarding. Though I was an outsider who knew no one at the Firehouse and was dealing with a great many people at a time when they were in considerable pain, I was treated with remarkable grace, generosity of spirit, and finally good humor by everyone there. From the start, the widows of the 11 men from 4035 who died on September 11th granted me the most important thing they had, their trust. One of the things that is very attractive about the Firehouse from the perspective of a reporter is that it is a rare, spin-free zone in America. In an America where the job of inflating the reputations of people with negligible larger social value has become a major growth industry, firemen do what they do because they love doing it, not because they want the plaudits of outsiders. Instead, what they want most is the respect of their peers. In some ways, theirs is a hermetically sealed world. Very few of their heroics are ever written about, and most of the great stories within the world of firefighting are passed on as part of an oral tradition rather than the city's daily newspapers or on local television newscasts. Because of their traditions and because of the way firefighters live and how intimate their knowledge is of one another, you cannot con anyone in a firehouse. Within the house, you're always being measured. It is a mandatory process given the constancy of the dangers the men face. The contrast between their world and some of the other more ego-driven and materialistic worlds that I've been covering in recent years is striking. Even as I was going to the Firehouse every day, the Enron scandal was breaking, serving as a daily reminder to the exact opposite kind of leadership and values. I think that's enough reading. Thank you.
So I think you can see that how wonderfully intimate some of the portraits are, and what one is struck by is, of course, that the people that you were talking about, for the most part, were all dead. So you're really mining the memories and the experiences of their loved ones and the survivors of that. And by the way, part of the proceeds of this book go to those survivors, so people should know that. I wondered how it was that this story attracted you. I know that it was an article and then became a book, but generally speaking, in your work, you go where others have not been. And this is a story that's going to be covered quite a lot September 11th, and in particular, the work of the firefighters. What drew you to it?
I think, I'm a New Yorker. When I was a young man, I went 12,000 miles to find the dangers and the cutting edge of conflict in our time, and late in my life, it took place 4 miles from where my family and I live, and this is an assault upon the city, upon the values of freedom that make America special, the ability to have an open democratic society. It's a very serious challenge, and my great memory of that day is of everybody else leaving those buildings and the firemen going in, and that's quite staggering. I think the book is a form of therapy. I think everybody wants to contribute. A moment like this in a city, and you want to make an offering. We're not a wealthy family. My family, writers who don't sell the movies are never wealthy. But what can you offer? You can offer your talent. 100 years from now, what happened that day? Apocalyptic day. Here's this, one of the worst days in American history, maybe the worst day in New York history, and it strikes people disproportionately. As in all things, a very few people pay a higher price than most. And that's part of the covenant that firefighters and others make, just as it's a part of the covenant that someone who's with the 10th Mountain Division in Afghanistan makes. But this terrible day hits this one institution where these lives are woven together in a way that almost nobody's life is woven together anymore in America, where we have really dramatically less community, where the kind of relationships, for a variety of technological reasons, are just not as strong as they were in America that I grew up in. So what happened that day? Who were the men? What did they do? Why did they do it? I thought if you could tell that story of that little institution, that home, that family, you would be using your talents well. And I wanted to do it. My wife, who has a very, very good sense of what I should and should not do, really wanted me to do it. And I went over there from day one and was treated with very special grace. But I think it was a form of therapy for me. I wanted to participate. And I think it became in some ways a form of therapy for some of the men, talking to me about their friends, wanting to memorialize them. It became quite easy to talk to them. And I think it was an oddly healthy working relationship that we very quickly established.
One of the things that's interesting is that you've also written the foreword to the September 11th book of photographs by the Magnum photographers. And you say then that day separated us from then and now, made the difference between then and now.
Oh, I think so. You know, I mean, it was a very I mean, can anybody remember that on the morning of September 11th, I mean, the headlines in the paper, that morning there were probably 6 or 7 television teams camped out on the home of Congressman Condit and the Levy family, Chandra Levy's. I mean, the trivial agenda that had driven this country for 15 years, celebrity scandal, Hollywood stuff, all this. I mean, we're a serious power, and the frivolity, the trivialization of our agenda was just appalling. So I felt after that, I mean, I think that day separates us. The world came home to us. I mean, we've been a world power since 1917, really, when we went into World War I. And in that ensuing time, I mean, because of our oceans for a while, 2 oceans, then because of our supremacy of power and technological power, air power, SAC, missiles, none of the carnage, none of the terrible things that have afflicted most of the rest of the world ever touched us. This was, I think, the first time that we realize that there are no more immunities, that we are vulnerable, that there is nothing safe. We're going to have to figure out as a democracy how to hold on to freedoms and yet be strong. That's going to be a very complicated equation. So I felt that this was a watershed day, and when they asked me to do that little introduction for the Magnum book, which I think is very nicely done, I was, again, I mean, listen, there are things in life you do because you do for money, and there are things you do in life because you have a concept of civic virtue. And I mean, I think what I liked about the firemen was I felt in America, in the governing classes, a declining sense of civic virtue, a greater and greater materialism. People in every walk of life somehow, I mean, someone works in the White House and he or she comes out and there's an immediate $1 million or $500,000 a year job. I mean, everything can be maximized in our culture for money in the way that did not exist when I was young. And so I think one of the things I really liked about the Firehouse was the concept of civic virtue. These men, and now some women, but predominantly, and do what they do because it's a code of honor and they really want to go out. Or in the words of Angie Callahan, the widow of Captain Frank Callahan, where else can you be brave in a time of peace? And I find concepts of civic virtue very, very important. And I mean, my mother was a school teacher, and my father was a doctor, but he was a doctor on a long, hard journey to get to be a doctor. I mean, he was a poor immigrant son from a tiny town, Johnsonburg in Pennsylvania. I found his World War I letters to his sister, and they were always talking about, can we get out of the burg? I mean, finally they got to Western Massachusetts. But he got to be a doctor by dint of being a medic in World War I, and when World War II came along, he was a doctor, and he went back in the service at the age of 45. I mean, that's very important in the way you grow up. So this sense of civic virtue is very important to me.
Well, if we as a nation have to relearn, if you will, that sense, relearn to appreciate that sense of civic virtue, and I think some of what you've written suggests that. One of the reviewers said of your work that you have an ability to take a part of something and then shed light on the whole. And I wonder what the story of the firefighters and their bond and their response to the World Trade Center might say about us as a nation as a whole?
I don't know that it says anything larger about us as a nation. I think it's a reminder to people like me who are in the media that we don't always look in the right places, that even as we are watching too much of what is in front of us, and particularly in television, I mean, what goes on and passes for news there seems increasingly trivial, that there are people who go out every day, whether they are the firemen, policemen, or nurses in hospitals, who really do things that are vitally important to the fabric of this society, and do this because it is the right thing to do, and are disproportionately not given credit for the kinds of lives they lived. I think too much award is given. I remember, I really like Michael Jordan. He's a really nice young man. He handles a kind of fame in America that I would find crushing and unbearable, but I don't think he's a hero. And when I was doing that book that year on basketball, I mean, the book I did on the civil rights kids who really did go into the valley of the shadow of death in the early 60s and risked their lives in Alabama and Mississippi against the Klan. That book came out, and again, it was about the nobility of ordinary people. And I gave him an early copy, and I looked at him and I said, "Hey, Michael, these are my heroes." And it's really true. I think we look in the wrong places and we celebrate because we've morphed, because of television and Hollywood, we've morphed into an entertainment culture. We've really, and I put a lot of the blame on this on television, on the networks, on cable. It's a lot easier to do a stupid, what they call a magazine show on a bunch of Hollywood actors of the country's latest celebrity scandal than it is to do complicated reporting on complicated things. So we begin to think that Sylvester Stallone is a hero, or Bruce Willis or Harrison Ford is a hero because one of these men plays a hero in a movie. Well, Sylvester Stallone started out the Vietnam War teaching at Le Rosé School in Switzerland. I mean, he's not exactly a hero. I mean, he's got big muscles, but he's another guy who's in front of celluloid.
Have we learned anything?
No,
Have we
don't
changed
learn
our mind?
No, the formation, the economic formation of the networks is stuff, they're going to go right back to it. I mean, the people at ABC were talking about getting rid of Ted Koppel because he wasn't relevant. I mean, we're not going to, I mean, the economic formation of the networks has really changed, and not for the better.
I want you all to know that I'm not ignoring all this stuff about TV. I'm coming back to it. I'm trying to focus on the Firehouse book.
Okay. Well,
Not that I don't know the follow-up
Okay.
question. I was curious to know if you thought that our thoughts about the civic servants like the firemen have changed, or firefighters have changed since the World Trade Center.
I think that's gone up in a quantum way because I think it really came home. I remember seeing it, maybe you guys remember it, in the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, I think it was the middle of the O.J. trial, and it was a horror. I mean, you've just never seen in the O.J. Simpson trial so many really unlikable people of so little value come out of the woodwork and have their Andy Warhol 15 minutes, and a lot of them still don't want to go away. I mean, they're out, I want 15 more, I want 15 more. I mean, God, Monica Lewinsky's on television anytime. She wants another 15 minutes. Anyway, in the middle of that, this Oklahoma City tragedy, and the firemen came in from all over the country, really all over the world. And I sat there one night on CNN watching them, and I thought, well, that's the America that I remember as a boy. I mean, have we learned anything? I don't think so. I mean, I think people go out there and do the right thing, and I think they do the right thing because I think it's in their DNA. It's because their parents did these things and taught them. Their fathers were firemen. I think because they went to certain kind of parochial schools and the nuns got them early on or something. I mean, but I don't think it's the larger society. I think it's the interior family structure that gets it. I think the larger society has been sending up signs of far greater materialism than when I was a young man. I think the society, and part of that again is television. It's just the power of selling has just gone up a great deal in this country, and it has been an unconscious assault on a number of professions that don't have as great material rewards as other professions, I think.
What do you want the firemen to take away from the reading of the book? You've expressed what you want the rest of us to take away from it.
I mean, you said earlier, was it a message to the larger country? I mean, I think it's just, there are people out there who do wonderful things, and we ought to remember that. The firemen, I mean, I just wanted the people at that house I wanted to know that those men had really done something extraordinary, and someone ought to put it down and put down who they were and why they did these things. I think one of the things about the book that I'm proud of, if you started at the beginning and you've gone to this, let me give you a almost a professional person's dilemma, which is you come in from the outside and there are 12 men who are dead, and they seemingly are very similar. I mean, many of them are the sons of firemen, many are Irish, or even half Irish, half Italian. They all seem alike, and the challenge to a reporter is to show that they're not all alike, that there are these gradations of humanity and impulse and idiosyncrasy, that they come together at one moment as firemen, but that they're not all alike. And that was something that I worked very, very hard. I mean, they're not anonymous, that we all have, we're not just our stereotypes, we're our stereotypes and our idiosyncrasies blended together in some marvelous way. And I mean, I would like the firemen, I guess, if you asked, to know that it mattered.
What's the connection between ladder 4 outside here and ladder 35, engine 40, which you write about?
All firemen are connected to all other firemen. First, it's one of the great underground movements. It's the most powerful underground movement, far greater than the Communist Party ever was. I mean, really, you know. And when Joe McCarthy was talking about the insidious Communist Party with its long tentacles, it was the firemen. They all know each other, and they're all each other's brothers. It's really very true. I think the special connection between my Firehouse and these guys started when a guy named Ray Pfeiffer had a wife who needed a kidney transplant, and the only place they could do it was in a Boston hospital because they needed to do beds because her sister had to give the kidney. And for a while, Ray would drive up and sort of almost sleep in his car. I mean, firemen do not, you do this because you love doing it, not because of the enormous material rewards. And then his pal Mike Otten, who was one of the 12 men who died, would come with him. And then they connected to ladder 4. Right? And with that, there became a kind of bonding back and forth, baseball games. If it's at the stadium, these guys come down there. If it's Fenway up, and there's a real friendship, and all these guys came down and sort of became part of the extended family in the terrible days. But I think it started with Ray Pfeiffer, who is, a quite wonderful man. I mean, he's also been a man who's just been extremely helpful, not just to me, but in the vacuum of leadership at this house. He has stepped forward to really fill the roles of about 3 other men.
What about Kevin Shea? He was the one survivor of the 13 that went to the World Trade Center, and in your book, he's really
Kevin is really, he's banged up, and he doesn't know what his status is going to be, whether he'll be able to stay on as a fireman. Kevin went down there, and he got really literally blown away, and he got a broken neck, and he had a concussion, and lost 90% of the skin on his testicles. I mean, that he lived it all was a miracle. I mean, they found him unconscious in the rubble. Kevin is really a very unfireman-like fireman. He's just different. They used to tease him. All firemen have another job. They're plumbers, electricians, and I mentioned Jimmy Guyerson was a wallpaper guy. Kevin entertains at children's parties. And this, I read about Bruce Gary. Bruce Gary's a very tough guy, right? The guy with the Popeye arms. So you entertain at children's parties? Yeah, I'm Barney, or somebody else from Sesame Street. You can't have a guy from our Firehouse dressing up as a purple dinosaur or this Elmo guy. If you're going to do it, you got to go as Spider-Man. So the next time there's a Firehouse picnic and a lot of kids, there's Kevin as Spider-Man. He's offbeat, eccentric, very smart, a computer wizard. There'll be a place for him, but he's had a very hard time. He's struggling with survivor guilt. 13 guys go out. You're the only one come back. You begin to wonder, is everybody doubting me? Did I do something wrong? And he wasn't quite tuned, I thought, to the mood of the Firehouse. Anyway, then what happened, the New York Times did an article about him in the Sunday magazine. And the article was really okay, but the headline was just appalling. It was, which way did he run? And he questions his own courage. And the people at the firehouse went ballistic. I mean, you don't question you don't question a fireman's courage. I mean, that's an elemental thing. And they were really ballistic. And in an odd way, it really sort of, the ugliness over this, I mean, I think Captain Gormley did try and call members of the Supreme Court that day to stop the press run of the New York Times. And he did, I believe, call one of the editors and say that the old gray lady was wearing scarlet today. But anyway, I think the fact that the other firemen felt that Kevin had been abused by the Times helped make them embrace him and ease his reentry a bit. But I don't know what his status is, and I don't think he knows yet what his status is.
What has been the general overall across the city in terms of healing? Because 343 firefighters were lost. That's the number that we hear about. So now you've got guys going into their house. They weren't there before. They're replacing people who died.
I don't think you can even imagine it, I mean, I've tried to imagine it. I've tried to reverse the optic. There were a couple times when I was intimately involved in a kind of family-like professional atmosphere. I mean, when I was a young reporter on a very good paper in Tennessee, it was not a very big organization, and we were each other's friends. I mean, it was the height of civil rights stuff, and we were the unpopular paper because we were covering it, and so everybody was sort of beat up on us. We had to be each other's friends. And I've tried to think of what it would be like to lose in one day 12 of our group, and I've tried to think of the young group of reporters that I was part of when I was a young reporter in Vietnam, and there were about 8 or 10 of us, and what it would have been like to lose half. I mean, this is a family, and it's I guess because it's both an engine and a truck, there are 50 people in the varying shifts, and one day the very core of it's gone and 12 men are gone. I think it's like ripping something apart, and I think it's very hard, and it's still hard because I think the men, some of them are carried in the early months afterwards by so many things to do, taking care of families, filling this vacuum, lifting other guys, and and then you go through that, and there's that awful moment where you get through it all, and then you realize it isn't going to go away, that it's a permanent condition, that you've lost very, very close friends who are in your family, and they're not coming back. And it's like a second dip. I think they're in the second dip now. I think it's very hard.
I'm going to switch gears now and talk about that media that you are ready to talk about. Some years ago, you wrote a book called The Powers That Be, which really examines the power relationships in some of the biggest media organizations, including the New York Times and CBS News, and sort of pull the curtain back for people who didn't know much about journalism and how some decisions are made, and people were, at that time, fairly shocked about what they read. And now you're saying...
It's worse.
It's worse.
Yeah, but I mean, in two levels. First, the daily and print newspapers are just not as good as they could, as they used to be. The power of print has gone down for obvious technological reasons, television and other forms of media. Now we have the internet and whatever are on the ascent, and that's weakened the advertising base of newspapers. In addition, any number of large chains like Gannett have collected newspapers like their postage stamp, not in an idea of making them better, but in an idea of driving up the stock. What they do is they view their real customers not as the people who buy the newspaper, but as the people who buy the stock. And so that has weakened an enormous number of non-national newspapers like my old paper in Tennessee, or the Louisville Courier-Journal, or the Des Moines paper. Probably much more importantly is the change in the networks, and two things have happened. One is the coming. When I was writing then, you still had the proprietorial generation at CBS and NBC. You had Sarnoff and Bill Paley, and so there was some responsibility to the newsroom. There was a sense with Bill Paley, going back to the days of Ed Morrow, that the jewel in the crown was, for example, their foreign correspondents. I can still tell you the names of all the CBS correspondents of World War II. They were radio guys and then into television. That's gone, and it's not only managerial, it's super managerial. And the people who run these great corporations don't care about the news. They don't really care about it at all. And all these guys, even though America is a world power, have gotten out of, I think, largely gotten out, if not of the news business, certainly foreign reporting. I mean, they've all, my colleague Tom Brokaw is furious with me because I wrote in my last book that while he had written a book about the greatest generation, if there is a greatest generation, he had, the one thing that the people who fought in World War II did care about was the internationalization of America, that we be a part of the world and not have the isolation that brought us in. And yet he had presided over the moment when NBC, had, as well, the other networks, had gotten rid of all their foreign correspondents. So he's not very happy with me. That's the end of that friendship, if it was a friendship. There's a second thing in addition to the corporatization, and a corporate that doesn't care about this. I mean, in a giant corporation like General Electric, I mean, NBC News is a tiny hangnail. The second thing is, again, a huge technological change, and it is the coming of cable. And so when I was writing that book, there were really 3 networks. Suddenly you have cable, and suddenly guys on cable are fighting. And when there were the 3 networks, they really tried to make their news shows sort of like miniature New York Times. They cared about respectability. They wanted foreign reporting. When you get cable, suddenly on cable, everybody is fighting for one point in the ratings, and so you start getting tabloid, you start getting celebrity, you get Inside Edition, hard copy, all this stuff, anything with celebrity. And that, first off, that means the very coming of cable fragments the network's audience and cuts it in. I mean, their audience has been going down, down, down. The second thing is it becomes a challenge because this stuff is popular. I mean, you know, a great editor is someone who balances what people want to know with what they need to know, but there's not that much desire for that. So the networks have begun to imitate the cable shows with the tabloid and entertainment, so that they have become less and less serious, and there's more and more reporting about celebrity stuff and less about real foreign reporting. Well, so these things have changed the media profoundly and made it less serious.
Bill O'Reilly was here in this forum not long ago, and he said that's what people want. That's why Fox News the ratings are going through the roof.
Well, I'm sure it's been beneficial to him, but whether I said it, let me repeat, a great editor balances what people want to know with what they need to know, and that's been an old challenge, and giving people what they want, only what they want. I mean, if you think about when you raise a child, if you gave the child what he or she wanted at dinner, you wouldn't necessarily have a healthy person growing up. I think it's the same in news. I mean, obviously it's a pluralistic society and a very democratic one, but there's a lot to be said for evoking responsibility.
You're being kind tonight. Now let me say what you said at SMU when you were talking about the culture of celebrity. You said provocative works for TV. The more tabloid and provocative, the better. In our self-imposed social isolation, we have become a celebrity-obsessed society feeding on itself. Yeah, the self-obsessed media is chasing self-obsessed celebrities of little or no real importance. Tabloid magazines proliferated under the guise of news, and the greatest sin is not to be wrong, but to be boring.
Yeah, I agree with the guy who said that.
Yeah, it was you. You feel pretty strongly about it.
Well, I mean, it's really about, you know, we get these extraordinary freedoms. I mean, all my life, I've been able to enjoy the protection of the First Amendment. I wrote a book. I remember being here the day this building was dedicated, and there was real, I mean, when they dedicated this building, and I mean, I was put on a panel, there's a real question of whether I would be allowed to be on, because I'd been a little bit critical of, you know, The Best and the Brightest is somewhat of a revisionist book on the Kennedy, and I did say about a former Secretary of Defense that there is no other word, kinder word, he was a fool, and I could do that without fear of libel. In fact, he's gone around ever since, going around telling people he's not a fool, but that's, so I've had these enormous protections, as do my colleagues. But if you get these great freedoms, there are obligations to go with them. And those obligations are, with all due respect to Bill O'Reilly, they're very serious. You have to give back stuff. It isn't just about giving people what they need. I mean, I remember being a young reporter in Saigon. It was very unpopular being pessimistic. It was very easy to do it because it was clear to me that we were not going to win the war very early on, that what we were doing, this is 62, 63, and my job was that the readers of the New York Times not be surprised when the VC walked into Saigon. I mean, that was, just clearly that's the charge. You get this. And seeing these freedoms really maximized for the stock. If you had Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and Dan Rather here, and you said they would all agree, if they could, without losing their jobs, with everything I'm saying. Are they doing a good enough job? No. Do they have enough foreign reporting? No. Have they pulled back from the historic traditions that existed under Cronkite, Murrow, and whatever, and Huntley Brinkley when they joined those networks? Yes. Why do they do it? They don't have any choice because that's the way the corporation is gone. So, I'm lucky enough to have an independent voice and say this without a corporation taking away my microphone the next day.
Well, whoever they is, post 9/11, news is now returned to a more serious. I just want to get your response.
Well, as they say in the Yiddish tradition, God's ear to your lips. There was a moment where everybody was fascinated, but I think, serious foreign coverage. Yes, we're involved in Afghanistan, and that's serious, and yes, suddenly as the Middle East explodes, we're getting coverage there. But we really aren't. We only cover these things when bombs go off. We don't cover them day in and day out, trying to explain what a complicated world is, so that again, when bad things happen, we say, how could they do that to us? We're Americans. Nothing has any history to it, so we separate. The news comes, and it comes in an explosion, and we cover it. We don't cover the stuff that helps explain. So no, they haven't really changed very much. They haven't really gone in and used their energies. I don't think there's been much real change in value. I haven't seen them going out trying to hire a lot of good young foreign correspondents.
Now, we're about to open this up to questions from the floor, but before, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, how do you write 17 books and you keep cranking out the articles and you just have to answer, how do you do that?
18.
Okay, 18, and see?
I think very lucky. I think I was very lucky in my choices. I got a profession that fitted who I was psychologically and intellectually, that it works for me. I can do it quickly. I've gotten, I think, better as I've gotten older. I know when to let go a little bit more now. I used to probably do too much, and the books maybe were too long, and I maybe worked on them. I just think I've been very lucky in doing things. I don't know why people have gifts. I have a gift, I think. The gifts I have, plus 30 or 40 years, 45 years, 6 years, doing this, you begin to get a craft of how to talk to people, what is there, how to go about it, how to do your interviews, and I'm able to work hard. My health has been quite good, and I work with discipline, and I know what not to do. At the beginning of a project, I can sort of say, oh, that particular project, I don't think I'll be good at that. It's a tar baby, and I think part of it is in saying no to certain things that come your way because it wouldn't be good for you. But I think it's been I've been able to write relatively quickly and to work. And the other thing is I really like what I do. I loved going to the Firehouse. I really liked talking to the men. I liked listening to other people. I enjoyed. I'm doing a book now on a battle in the Korean War. I love talking to the veterans. I mean, I just enjoy hearing people's stories. So I felt this is a really enriching career. I mean, to go out and be paid to learn for 47 years, to go out and listen to people, to have the capacity to grow yourself. You know, you do this long, you change. I mean, you become, I think, a richer person within. So this has been a wonderful journey. And then to get people buy you and take you into their homes. I mean, that's a great, great privilege in this country. I mean, how lucky can you be?
You wrote once that you felt that your life was a gift coming away from Vietnam, where so many people lost their lives, and that motivated you to work very, very
You've
hard.
really done your homework. Yeah, I think, you know, you came there and I was scared there and I was scared in Mississippi and scared in the Congo, and you get out of it and you come back and think, oh boy. And I did well because I got all those prizes, so that helped. I thought, I'm not going to waste this. I mean, it was suddenly, you thought, I made it back, other guys didn't. I'm not going to waste the ticket they gave me. And that's probably generational. That's probably about being, growing up touched by the Depression. I'm born in 1934, so and part of it is being the first really member of our family to be that successful. You get a chance. I mean, I can look at varying members of my family in a previous generation who didn't get this opportunity. I mean, one of my uncles who might have been a wonderful police reporter who worked in a commercial paint store downtown on Tremont Street all those years because he didn't have the opportunity to get in. He would have been a great police reporter. He just knew everything. He picked up, talked to people. I used to look at him and think, God, he'd been really good as a police reporter. I got the ticket. And if you get that ticket, you really want to go with it. You know, what a great blessing to do this. And, you know, I am not under-rewarded in this society. I look at it. My father died when I was relatively young, and I really would have loved for him to, because I was such a screw-up when I was a student here. I was in probably the bottom third of my class, and I really wanted like him to know that it worked out. And I did okay, and I used the ticket well.
Okay. The microphones are open for any questions that you may have. Questions, no statements. Say your name and go for it, right here.
Hi, my name's Samantha Bolton, and I know journalists tell good bar stories. And I just wanted to know, what was the most difficult story you ever covered, and what was the funniest story you ever covered?
Good.
Funniest, I don't. A book I did, The Reckoning, was very, very hard because it was about the challenge of the auto industry of Japan to Detroit, and it was about business. Businessmen are not easy to talk to. Japan is a very, very hard place to work. I thought it summoned levels of ability to work there. The Japanese, by nature, do not give out, as one of them says, it's the black hole of the universe in terms of communication. You're supposed to get information from other people but not give it out. It wasn't that the language was difficult. I had a good translator. It was a cultural thing. That was extremely hard. And Vietnam was not hard. Vietnam was really pretty easy. In '64, I came back from Vietnam, from 2 years in Vietnam and 1 year in the Congo, and I went to Mississippi. That was the Mississippi summer. And I was really scared. I was as scared in Mississippi in that summer as I was in Vietnam. And I think that was the summer when they killed the 3 kids and everything was breaking loose. And I think the idea that native sons were being killed in America simply for wanting to vote, something so elemental that you were, and obviously journalists were a target. I hated being afraid in my own country. I mean, that was really hard. I didn't like that. I can't really think of anything that's the funniest thing, but if you invite me back, I'll try and on the way.
Okay, here. Tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Troit. I'm a student at the law school. I was invigorated by some of your comments earlier about America placing too much emphasis on materialism and less emphasis on civic virtue. And I'm wondering what you feel that we or you or us collectively can do to try to reintroduce some of those values that you grew up with to society now.
I think it's a very hard question because there's a dynamic in this society that is now driven by the stock market. I think it's, for example, I mean, when I'm old enough to remember Pearl Harbor, and I can remember the little ditty they used to have, any bonds today, bonds are freedom, that's what I'm selling, any bonds today. And you were supposed to buy 25-cent stamps, collect them, put them in the little book, and when you got 1875, you could turn it in, and I think in 10 years you got to be $25. Well, that would not work in the impatience of today's economy. I mean, one of the interesting things about 9/11, and this is not a criticism of the president, but I mean, he did a commercial that sounded almost like it was a travel commercial for American Express, telling us to travel, to do these things, because the economy needs us to keep pushing in. So I don't think you can change, given what the stock market is and the fact that it's now, in effect, people's capitalism, that everybody has a share of it. I mean, when I was a young man, only the very wealthy owned stock. Now, everybody, pensions, everybody's got stock, and the country has to drive forward. I mean, if something like Enron happens, and it threatens the economy of the city of New York. I think what you have to do now is have private civic virtue. I think it has to come from within. I think it has to come from the family, from the way you raise your children, the choices you pass on as to what is a life rich in the doing as opposed to life rich in some of the exterior rewards. I think one of the interesting things is there are people who have opted for careers that seem to have higher material rewards who are increasingly finding that it isn't really that satisfying, and maybe going into teaching or something else that gives you a greater sense of yourself. And I just think that that has to be a private thing these days.
Okay, over here.
Hi, I'm Ellen Connerton. I'm a member of the mid-career class here at the Kennedy School. And I appreciated Callie's question about giving more respect to civil servants in this day and age. And you responded talking about police and fire departments. But there are other groups of civil servants who are really not being treated well right now, particularly in Massachusetts in the budget. We've seen hundreds of social workers for the Department of Social Services and the Welfare Office lose their jobs. And unless there's a big change in the budget, we're going to lose a lot of teachers this year. You mentioned your mother was a teacher, and you talked about people suddenly deciding this is a more meaningful profession. What do you think we can do to show people that these civil servants are also very important and that society needs these workers?
I think we ought to stop talking about the government as if it's an enemy. And I think we ought to understand that the government, I mean, I think one of the things you realize is in a democratic society, the government is largely, I mean, it's often slow and it doesn't process things as quickly as the private sector. But it isn't the enemy. I've worked in countries where the government was the enemy, where the government really was dark. I mean, I was a correspondent in Eastern Europe in the 60s, and the government tried to, the government was an enemy. What we began to do, and I think it was a mistake, we began to talk, and we still do it on political terms, talk about Washington as if it's this evil, sinister city. Actually, it's a pretty accurate reflection of the country. It is weighted too much probably these days to special interests, always has been, but the amount of money we pour into the political system in campaign after campaign has weighted it more towards special interest than when I was younger. I mean, I don't know whether you're going to have campaign finance reform, and I don't know if it is passed. I happen to be very admiring of John McCain. If it's passed, that it'll actually work, but I think that you know, there are just so many people leaving the Senate because or public life because they spend all their time trying to raise money. That's all they do, and that ends up driving good people out. And we ought to get away to go back to what I said earlier, the idea that government is an enemy. I mean, it's really a reflection of us, and if you think about it, the government of the United States really works pretty well. I mean, it's very hard for government in an age of high technology where speed, internet, international commerce, which is done on computers, money winging across the country. And then you have a slow, deliberative House and Senate, and you have courts, and you have an executive branch. And out of all of this, I mean, it's not going to keep up with the speed, the ever-accelerating speed of daily commercial life. But this is a society which is extraordinarily strong, extraordinarily free. I mean, we argue all the time about definitions of personal freedom, but we have we have not only military strength, great economic strength, and just astonishing levels of personal freedom. And I don't think that's, by the way, by happenstance. I mean, I think our economic strength comes from our personal freedom. I really think all this stuff works together, that this country is unparalleled in a number of additional things, the land-grant colleges and our immigration policy. I think we are, for a variety of reasons, we continue to be the most regenerative society in the world. We continue to be reborn, but we ought to be, we ought to think that maybe we're pretty well governed. Maybe. If we aren't, then why are we in some ways doing pretty well?
Okay.
Hello, my name is Yerika Kurikata. I'm an alumni. My question was on your writing process. Do you start out with the end in mind, or do you find that it forms as long as you're writing? And do you find that it vastly differs from what you had thought in the beginning?
Well, the last book is really a little different because it had its own built-in confines, and I think it was something. Let me talk about it. I mean, I went over there for about 2 weeks, and I called my editor at Vanity Fair, and I said, I think it's not just a magazine piece, it's a small book. I mean, I could just see. I mean, if you're really, magazine articles are 4,000 or 5,000 words. A long one is 6,000. I was dealing with this epic event, and 12 men were killed, so I ended up getting 13,000 words. I mean, you had to define all these different people. But so I was from the beginning working at 2 levels. I knew what was for Vanity Fair and what was for this book that I then envisioned. And so I always knew, and I knew the limits. If I did 3 more months on the book, it wouldn't have been better. It might have been worse. I mean, I got in and out, and I got as much of those men and who they were and why they did it as you probably should have. I mean, I think I got it. On other books that you do, there's sort of a longer book. A book has an orbital thrust. And you start with the question, why did this happen? Best and brightest. Everybody said these men were the ablest men to have served in government in this century, yet Vietnam might have been the worst tragedy, therefore a detective novel. How did it happen and why? Who were they? And you go from that, and you don't really know. You start with a question, and it has its own dynamic, and sometimes the book takes you in ways that you didn't think you would go, and that's the great fun, the learning curve. I mean, you go with the question, not with the answer, and that has been the richness of my life.
Thank you.
Joe?
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm a freshman at the college. My question is a little hypothetical. I mean, you've covered some amazing events in your lifetime, and if you could take an event that you didn't live through from history, that you could have been there to write about, I was just wondering what that would be.
Well, boy, that's one. Well, I would think if you could cover it and live to tell the story, the Battle of Stalingrad. I mean, this is the epic battle where Hitler goes into Russia. Up till then, he's on this extraordinary winning streak, and he miscalculates the strength of Russia and the winter, and it's an epic battle that turns the entire tide of World War II, and millions of men die. And it's really the high watermark of the Third Reich, and everything begins in the fall of 1942, I believe it is. And from that, all these other things, and it is still, I mean, I still read about the Eastern Front and the Battle of Stalingrad, and I can't. So, I mean, would I have wanted to be there? Not really, but if I could have somehow covered it and gotten out to a warm press center, yeah, I mean, that's...
Up in the top there.
William Venz, I'm a student at the business school. After the September 11th attacks, there were some questions about whether the right decision was made for the firemen to run in when others were running out. Some feel to even pose that question at best shows that you're just ignorant about the sort of esprit de corps necessary to run a firehouse. Others, would say it's even disrespectful to ask the question. Did you come to a resolution or a conclusion on that?
Well, I think firemen do what they have to do and what they're trained for. And I think the one thing that I think it underlined is that the quality of their communications gear isn't nearly as good as it should be. It's not on the cutting edge, and they, particularly for men who have to deal in fires in high rises like New York, it should be better. I think that's a gnawing feeling. Other than that, they did what firemen are supposed to do. And they did it. No one knew what the extent of the tragedy was going to be. I mean, this was brand new. It happened as it happened. And the command post, remember, got wiped out very early so that it was like cutting off the nerve center. I think the one thing that you would probably do is say these men should not go anywhere in a city like New York without the very best modern communications gear. I mean, anybody who sends a New York fireman into a high-rise ought to be able to say, would I send my own son and daughter in with this equipment, or is there better equipment that could be purchased if we were not being too budget conscious? I think that's the one question that I would sort of pose. I don't think the firemen that I know think that wrong decisions were made. I think they do question some of the equipment.
Hi, I have a question about Doris Kearns Goodwin. Recently with her problems, and I was wondering, the media really seemed to relish in beating her up over her plagiarism. And how do you feel about how the media has treated her, and if you had any close calls yourself with plagiarism?
Well, so far, none. I mean, she's a pal. I'm a great fan. I think she's a wonderful person. I think she's been a very good colleague, a very good citizen. I can't imagine that there aren't a lot of people here who haven't in some way or another had a connection with Doris and been the better for her. I can't believe that she hasn't done things for this center here. She has always been the best kind of colleagues. Secondly, those books are not machine tooled. I mean, they come out every 6 or 7 years. She has not rushed them out. I mean, she obviously made some mistake, and why that mistake was made must puzzle her as it puzzles people like me. Because generally you can hear when you can see or you can pick up on your own voice. I mean, there's a cadence that writers have, and when it's not there, when someone's over-edited, your little, they've edited me too much, detector goes off like a sort of a fire alarm, fire detector. I think she's been much too much beat up. I thought the Times, for a variety of reasons, ran too many stories. I thought it got on. I mean, part of it was that Doris, is a good citizen, so she sort of came front and apologized, and then stuff kept coming out. And they did a stupid parody on the op-ed page that people thought was real, in which it sort of claimed to show that her baseball book was plagiarized, which wasn't true. I mean, it was very. I thought there were too many stories. I was a runner-up on the Pulitzer this year. I fell 1 vote short, so I always wondered if she hadn't left the Pulitzer board whether I would have gotten that vote or not. I mean, sort of, did this cause tragedy in our family as well? She's a really good citizen. I can remember doing a freebie for the Boston Public Library a few years ago, and Doris was on the board, and she'd flown in on a red-eye to go to the library meeting. And I think most guys I know would fly on a plane to get away from going to a library board meeting. So part of it is she's very visible, because she's on television a lot, and because she's, on varying boards. She's on the Pulitzer board, she's on I guess, on the Harvard Overseers board. And for whatever reason, that visibility in our society, in a scandal, celebrity-oriented society, made her more vulnerable. And I think she, unlike Stephen Ambrose, chose to try and deal with it, and that fed the fires of it. But I think she'll be fine. She's doing a book on Lincoln. It'll be a good book. She's got the affection of a lot of colleagues who know that she's gone through something difficult and painful, but are, if you're a pal yesterday and Doris is a really good, straight person, and so I don't know what mistakes she made back there, but I'm on her side. I mean, I'll be her pal tomorrow.
Thank you.
Right here?
Thank you, Ms. Crossley. Good evening, Mr. Halberstam. My name is Manik Suri. I'm a freshman at the college. I had a question to ask you, less as a writer and more as a historian. I was intrigued by your comments on civic virtue and the need for us to exercise more private virtue, perhaps, in incoming generations. I was wondering if you could maybe comment on, I know we don't like to talk about the fall of civilizations, but as a historian, you must know as well as any of us that civilizations often and necessarily come to an end. And though we live in an age where America appears to be very prosperous and what some have termed the American age, I was wondering if you could comment on how our increasing trivialization of important issues and focus on materialism may contribute to the decline of American civilization in an increasingly globalized world. And I know many people have commented on how post 9/11 there may be greater challenges America will face. I was wondering if you could comment as a historian on how you feel.
Well, I think that's a reach for me as a historian, because you really ought to be more of a classical historian than I am. Part of that is really outside my range. What I would footnote is that we are rewarding things that don't matter too heavily and not rewarding things that do matter enough. And I think we're wasting too many children in this country. There are too many children who don't start out at a level and don't have as fair a shot at a full life as my children, probably the children of most of people in this room. And that's something that bothers me. On your larger question, decline of civilization, there are a lot of other people in this general area that would answer that better. I think I'll not open that door.
We've come to the end of our discussion. Well, okay, I'll take this one because you've been standing there. Okay, Bill, don't hate me.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
If you had only one newspaper to read, what would it be?
Oh, only one news? I'd read the New York Times. I think it's very good. I think it's, it's changed. I think it's now in many ways better than it's ever been. I think the talent level of the young people there is very high. I think they've adapted. Journalism changes, and they've adapted to a television world. They've adapted to a changing New York City, changing demographics. They've become increasingly a national paper, but I think it's an awfully, awfully good paper. I'm just quite staggered by the overall level of talent, which is, I left there 35 years ago. The general level of talent is significantly higher than when I was there.
Okay, so I have moderator privilege to have the last question.
Okay.
If you were not David Halberstam and could fulfill whatever your Walter Mitty dream was, what would you be doing?
Can I get young enough to play first base for a baseball team? Left-handed. I'm too old. Maybe DH. I don't know. I think there's so many. There's so many things out there. But I'd probably come back to wanting to be a writer and to do the things I want. Dreams of glory. Walter Mitty. There are people I admire greatly. I admired General Matthew Ridgway, who I thought was a great soldier in Vietnam and in Korea. Not in Vietnam, in World War II and in Korea, and who kept us out of Vietnam in 1954. There are people that are, that have great enviable lives, and I'm not sure I'd be very good at that. Maybe I'm good at what I do because I don't do the things that are temperamentally not well suited for me.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Yes, it was great.